Welcome to A Leader's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Joel Gunn, and today I have Josh Arrington back with me. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
It's good to have you. Your last couple of podcasts have been well received, so I'm excited to have you back. We were talking just before the show about a Deloitte study that you'd come across saying that typical culture change or instilling the culture you want takes several years. Why don't we start off there?
Yeah, the Deloitte study says that to move culture or to establish culture is a 3 to 5 year period minimum. There are other studies that show it being more typically 7 to 9 years. Regardless of where the actual number is, if you were to bell curve this, the bell curve is definitely skewed to the right. So people who think we're going to do this exercise and we're going to establish culture, we're going to create culture, and we're going to do it in a year, which I see organizations do all the time, it's not going to work. You're going to end up in either failure or frustration because it is a long-term process to establish culture.
Why do you think companies get tempted to go for the, hey, we can change our culture in the next year? What's the driver?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's because they were never focused on culture and intention about culture, so they begin to realize that they have massive flaws in their culture. And so they're trying to come up with a fix. We'll just fix culture. We'll just twist this. So I think that's one reason they think they can do it and do it quickly. I think another reason is it's this pop sort of word. It's this, you go to any leadership summit, you go to any kind of thing, and at some point there's going to be a conversation about culture. And so someone who's never really focused on that goes, okay, well, we'll make that our focus this year or this 6-month period. We'll make establishment of culture our focus. And so they do often. I mean, Deloitte is not cheap. So they spend a lot of money on an organization to come in and do all this coaching and do all these things. And then they think they've arrived because they've really just started. And so I think that drives a lot of people to think they can do it quickly.
Is part of that assumption a misunderstanding of what culture is?
Absolutely. We boil it down to, because when your consultants come in, these people come in, a lot of times it's, let's create the language, let's create the acronyms, let's create the marketing materials, all of this stuff. And they think that is what culture is. And for me, I think culture is to a group of people or an organization what character is to an individual, which means it's established over a long period of time, but it's what you're known by and what you're known for. Character as an individual, it's what your character is known by other people. It's what you're known for by other people. As an organization, it's what do your employees say when no one's around, when no one's looking? What are they telling their wife in the evening? What are they telling their friends when they're hanging out? And instead, what we do a lot of times with culture is it becomes this, let me tell you about myself. And it becomes nothing more than an extension of marketing. Mm-hmm. It's like when someone starts telling you how much of a high character person they are, and they may be, but it certainly doesn't carry the weight as when you hear from a multiplicity of other people about the character of someone. And just as character is born out and earned over a long period of time, so too is culture. And then one of the fringe benefits of that becomes when character is defined over a long period of time, when someone does something that's out of character, it's a lot easier to be gracious and understanding that was the blip, right? And we're all guilty of that. We could tell all kinds of stories on times we've seen that. I remember playing golf with a good buddy. We'd been friends for years, knew him really, really well. He was very patient, very, steady. Like his character was in these things. And on about his fourth just shanked shot, he threw his club and there were some words that came out of his mouth. And it never crossed my mind that was his character, right? But why? Because I'd known him for 10 years and knew his character. Culture's the same way. But if you haven't taken the time to establish that, and we see that, then we have questions of character or questions of culture that happen in that. It's a much deeper thing than most people realize, I think.
As you were sharing that, I remember hearing a story, and I don't know how much of this was, became lore versus the original fact. But when HP, Hewlett-Packard, was born in Silicon Valley, and so they, their people grew up there. They were had a lot of early employees, and then things happened, and they were basically closing down the original HP site. And so they go in and make the announcement, hey, we're, shutting the factory down or shutting the organization down here. And the new leaders and the new ownership or whatever was involved. And so they make the announcement, and everybody, gets up and quietly exits the room and goes back to work, which shocked the new leadership. And so they're actually asking the people, and I think even the news got involved at one point, like, what are you doing? Like, we built this culture on having a great reputation for doing really solid technology, and it's too important to us just to walk away. We've at least got to wrap up things in a great way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think that, character and culture, personal character, group culture, is the greatest manager of expectations that you can have. People have heard it before, the gap between expectations and reality. When expectations are much higher than reality, there's negative emotions and negative feelings and negative things, and vice versa. When reality supersedes expectations, then you have the positive emotions. But our culture and our character set they set the plumb line for which people know what to expect from the organization. And I think another thing that's important to note is that every organization has a culture. It may be a good culture, it may be a bad culture, and you may never have done a culture study or done anything on it, but you have a culture because people have expectations. Internally, people have expectations of how the dynamics are going to work. Externally, people have you have a reputation. Those are your culture. Whether you're focused on it or not, you have that. And so the HP example is great. They went because the expectation was set that we deliver really great technology. We don't like this news, but here's where we are. And when we walk through it, and I talked to you a little bit beforehand about some of the things I've sort of identified in culture, that's where you end up at. You end up at a point that it becomes a part of identity. For the people who are involved.
Just before the show, you were contrasting two organizations, one that was 20 times the size of the other, and what you accomplished with the smaller organization.
Yeah, and honestly, it's probably far more than 20 times. It's probably more 200x that I had served at and had this massive budget. And there were some things that I just never even attempted to pull off in that environment because of the culture. And several years later, working with this much smaller organization with a much less experienced staff, but had gotten to shape and create the culture. The first organization, I'd sort of come into the culture. This one, I got to shape and create culture over a long period of time. And we were able to pull off things that we would never have done at the larger organization. And it wasn't because we were more nimble or, it was none of that. It was, we had just created a culture of collaboration. We had created a culture of mutual feedback. We'd created all these things. And so it allowed us to do things that were far beyond our size and our scope. And I think if you start diving into a lot of companies, we use the phrase, they box above their weight class, or whatever the phrase is that might be used. If you start looking at those organizations, quite often I think what you find is it's not exceptional talent, it's not exceptional brilliance. All that may be there as well, but more often than not, that organization has exceptional culture that everyone is bought into and everyone's a part of, that allows them to be fully functional. Versus the larger organizational that may have large pockets of dysfunction, and therefore they're able to fight at a different level.
What are some words you would use to describe bad culture?
Toxic, questioning. I think one of the things that happens, that may seem like a weird word to use. I think one of the things that happen with a bad culture is people are constantly on edge. They're constantly questioning. There is no management of expectations, right? So A plus B might equal C, but A plus B tomorrow might equal F12. Like you don't know what the response is going to be. And so as a result, people begin to question their own actions. They begin to pull back and be tentative. And then it becomes toil. Their job, their function, their whatever is just something they do because they need a paycheck. The passion begins to diminish. The joy begins to diminish. And I'm a firm believer that when we work, our work should be life-giving. That doesn't mean there aren't things in our work that we're going to not like. Like, I don't like sitting all day at a desk and doing a bunch of administrative things ad nauseum. I'm not talking about the particular task, but I'm talking about overall our work, regardless of what we're doing, should bring us purpose and passion. And good cultures do that. And bad cultures boil that down to a place where you're miserable. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of complacency. There's a lack of ingenuity. There's a lack of innovation. There's a huge lack of collaboration, which if there's anything we've learned in recent years from watching, especially in the tech world, the fastest advances we've had in technology have come through really good collaboration, sometimes even between different companies, not even, all that disappears when you have a toxic or a bad culture. And I also find typically in those organizations, the people further up the hierarchy are the most isolated from the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. And if it's not actual, it's certainly perceived and felt that there is this massive amount of isolation.
What kinds of actions or inactions do you think contribute to that perception that the lower ranks feel like the upper ranks don't care or disconnected or disinterested? What's that manifest like?
Yeah. What is it? Are you asking what does it look like in actual practice, or are you looking at what causes that?
Well, both, but whichever way you want to
go. I'll start with the causality first. I think the causality is just a lack of appreciation of what other people do. We have a really weird way that we value other people's work. We will at the same time say, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. But then you would have to pay me X number of dollars for me to do that. But then when we hire somebody to do that, we don't want to pay them what we just said it would take to pay me. There's a lot of pride in things. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of frankly, arrogance in it. So I think a lot of the causality sometimes is that we don't value people's contributions very well. And then I think some of it is just as you move up in hierarchies, there is this innate sense that in order to get people to do things, in order to get the KPIs and everything that needs to be done met, I have to not lead people to success, but I have to drive people to success. And there's a massive difference between those two as it flows down. And so we start losing the personal connection. Very few organizations, as they grow in scope and size, are willing to continue to put the pieces in place to keep organizational connectivity really high. And so what do? Instead of having leaders who are, whatever team they're leading, they're deeply connected with, we begin to turn to systems. We turn to systems, we turn to technology, we turn to all kinds of other things to drive that information, and the personal connection part begins to disappear. I think that's one of the big pushbacks that you're seeing right now with the crazy advances we've seen in technology recently. And it's one of the big questions about where we're going with AI. I know AI is a big thing for you, is how far can we really go? Because innate in all of us is a desire for connectivity. Mm-hmm. So when we start giving away things where connectivity is important, then you start having a breakdown within the system.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that perhaps in a minute, but you mentioned a moment ago this almost an arrogance that leaders assume. And I've seen some good cultures in all kinds of companies, right? So manufacturing to medical to, so dirty jobs to clean jobs and everything in between. And I was, as you were sharing, I had a flashback of a business owner at a manufacturing company, and I would say they were one of the cleanest facilities that I've ever been in, and yet kind of in the dirtier, dock doors were open, no AC, big fans, working with steel and other things, but a very clean plant. And I kind of caught me off guard a little bit, to be honest, when I visited, and I never really understood why until one day I'm walking through the plant with the owner. Now, the owner would drive up in his Mercedes. He'd get out in his $3,000 suit. Really great person. The few hours I got to spend with him over the years, and he always wore a bow tie. That was his thing.
Oh gosh!
So just this really prim and proper kind of look. His office was immaculate. And so one day we're walking out on the floor. Well, two things. You've heard this about great leaders. He's calling people by name. And I've seen that before. But this is what caught my attention. So we're just walking along, and all of a sudden, like, I'm used to him in my peripheral vision as we're walking, and he disappears. And I realize he's bent over and he's picking up a piece of trash and putting it in a nearby bin. And one of the employees like, "Oh, sorry, sir, I was going to get to that." And, he didn't say anything. He just smiled, and we kept walking and talking. But he had communicated, one of the reasons his shop was one of the cleanest I'd ever been in, even though, open bay doors and steel and those things those kinds of operations tend to get dirty. One of the reasons it wasn't was because he demonstrated he was willing to pick up the trash. He didn't chastise anybody for it. He wasn't upset about it. It didn't bother him. He felt like that was his job. And everybody knew it was genuine. I felt the genuineness of it. His employees knew it was authentic. And so they modeled after. And there was no, remember to clean up yourself, your mom doesn't work here. None of those signs, just the fact that they saw him in action.
If we get a chance and we go through sort of the four things I think lead us to good culture, one of them is cultivation. And cultivation is exactly what you're talking about. It's cultivated from the top. And it's far more in actions than it is in words or posters or anything else, right? And also, just to clarify too, when I say arrogance, I'm not talking about being prideful. I'm talking about being teachable. Like, to me, the definition of arrogance has nothing to do with pride. Mm-hmm. To me, the definition of arrogance is being unteachable.
Agreed.
And so when you have leaders that get to a point where they believe their own press clippings, literally quite often, that they're the expert, right? Then how does that person remain teachable for the young person who's doing the internship, who sees something and goes, "Hey, I saw a clip literally just in the last day or two, and I don't even remember where I saw it on. It was probably some random reel on social media kind of thing. And it's a coach going over game film with all the players. And one of the players has his young son in the room, and his son says something after one of the clips, and the player starts apologizing to the coach, and the coach asks the kid, and what the kid said is, the running back on the other team tugs his jersey every time before he runs the ball. All these coaches had seen this.
And nobody
all these
saw
players are breaking it down, and they're breaking down the X and the O's and the technicalities and all of these things. And it's this young kid who looks at it and sees, yeah, but he tugs his jersey every time. And now they have something to see. But so often as organizations have success and your press clippings grow and your accolades grow and you're told how great you are and all these things, are you still willing to listen to what the other people are saying and be teachable for what they're saying? We mentioned earlier the two different organizations and what we're able to accomplish. I think one of the biggest things in that was I fully understand that 30% at least of what I throw out is garbage. It just is. And I need people to be able to show me when it is and why it is. And let's recycle that and turn it into something better. And I think that's true of any leader, of any person, is when you isolate yourself, you lose that opportunity to be teachable.
Yeah, I think the best leaders that I've met, and I've been blessed to meet a lot, we would tend to say they have a form of humility. Teachable is another word, that definitely fits in that context. And I think it's a characteristic that people perceive without the words being said. In other words, you don't have to spend a lot of time with somebody, especially in business setting, to determine if they're teachable or not.
You're right.
And a lot of times it's almost at the perception level. You just know, right, that this person's humble or they're not. They're teachable or they're not.
And it's weird because even when we use the word teachable, there's this innate conditioned perception that it means you have an expert who is teaching down to a person who's not an expert. So that leader might say, I'm absolutely teachable. I go every year and I do this round table, or I do this summit, or I do these things. See, I'm teachable. When people who are further along than I am teach, that's not the kind of teachable I'm talking about. Teachable is like being willing to learn from whatever source, because it's not a power dynamic. It's not a position dynamic. It's an ability to listen. In your people in your organization, when that exists, their buy-in goes up exponentially, because they begin to believe that when they have something to offer, it may not be implemented, but it will be accepted.
Or at least heard.
At least heard, exactly. And when it's the other direction, then it's not. And by the way, when it is heard, we need to give all the credit and all the honor and all the everything to the people who brought it to the table. I know I'll probably offend some people on this. I just refuse to ever. I've gotten over the years numerous opportunities to be included on certain lists. Right, you're the whatever under whatever. You're the whatever. Now we're at the point I'm the whatever over whatever. Right, kind of thing. Or you're on this list or this list or this list. No, because I didn't do anything to get there. Right, I don't want to accolade myself. I want to accolade other people. I want to, as a leader, lift up other people. I want to exalt what they've done. So that's the other thing that happened. Even if you take it and then you take credit for it, or even if you don't take credit for it, but you don't give credit for whatever was contributed, right? The feeling is still the same. People want to feel valued. They want to feel appreciated. And when they do, motivation goes through the roof.
Yeah, it's interesting. Back in my 20s, I was working in a Fortune 500 company, and I had a boss. So we all turned in weekly reports, status reports, large company. So trying to aggregate things up. And so everybody turned in a one pager. Well, I had one boss that would take the one pager and take the information and put it into first person when he'd go report it to the vice president. I had another boss. The first boss, by the way, wasn't a good boss. The next boss was a good boss. Major difference. He would take it, and when he passed it up the chain, Joel did this, John did this, Kelly did this, right? And very, very rarely, and I happen to see occasional copies of what he submitted to the VP, and almost never was it, I did this, I did this, I did this. And it was quite the contrast. for the most part, that was the major difference between those two leaders that I saw. One wasn't a particularly better person than the other, as as overall competency or I would even say character. The first boss ended up displaying some character flaws, but so did the second. But the reason the people liked working for the second boss was because he was good, and he didn't make a big deal out of it. But somehow humans knew he was passing credit up.
And when one of them walked in, what was your reaction different to each one when they walked in? When the first boss walks in, what's your reaction?
Yeah, well, I tried to be positive, but certainly wasn't as happy to see him as I was the other boss.
Internal stomach drop.
Yeah.
And when the second boss walks in, right?
Yeah, and the second boss, former Marine, and I was occasionally able to just reach over and close the door and say permission to speak freely. He says, go. Yeah. And I would say whatever was on my heart or mind. And we had an agreement. Once the door opened, though, he was the boss. And, I'd execute whatever he decided, but he would hear me out. And the other boss, there was very little trust. It actually got to a point with almost, I would say, close to zero trust. Not from me, I'm talking from the entire team. But the biggest difference they both had moral failures. So they weren't nowhere close to perfect, but everybody enjoyed working for the second boss because whether we knew it or not, he was promoting us up and not taking credit for stuff. And two, you could close the door and he'd hear you out, and then you open the door and he's the boss.
Well, we did a podcast with you. It's been several months ago, and we talked about we were talking about leadership, and as I recall, one of the things we talked about was how often we promote people because of cultural expertise versus true leadership skills. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a culture killer too, right? That's a thing where, but why do we do that? Because we think the only way we can value them is to promote them. Well, that shouldn't be accurate, right? Mm-hmm. So people with great cultural expertise, how do we value them and let them live in their area? But how do we take people with perhaps significantly less cultural expertise or
competency, technical competency.
Yeah, not cultural expertise, but competency. But we see amazing leadership and service and things in them and raise them up. So a lot of times even how we promote is done in a very broken manner. Mm-hmm. Because the higher up you go in an organization, more often than not, the less competency technically you need. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to have those people skills, those leadership skills, so that you can draw out that great competency from your people and from your staff and from your organization and find that. So,
one of the things we were talking about before the show, and I think this is a great place to segue into it, is this idea of accountability. How do you, people are always saying, hold me more accountable, right? Leaders say to other leaders, hold me more accountable. Or you hear leaders saying, how do I hold my people more accountable? What's your thoughts around accountability?
Yeah, I think accountability is another one of those buzzwords that's emerged in leadership culture over the last several years. And I think at its root, there's a really good reason for it. There's this, I want our organization to be one of accountability. But when it starts getting implemented, a lot of times what I see is if you have a hierarchy within the organization, I think a lot of times accountability flows downhill, meaning the people at the top want everyone below them to be accountable. And at the same time, they want loyalty to flow uphill, right? So the boss wants the employee to be accountable, and the boss wants the employee to be incredibly loyal to the boss. But the boss is not open to accountability from the employee and shows no loyalty to the employee. Mm-hmm. Well, those are two toxic culture creators, right? Mm-hmm. Those are two things right there. Accountability has to exist at every level. it is difficult when it's flowing up and down a hierarchy chart. I get that, but that's one of the things you have to be intentional about. How do we create the space and the time to do this, right? The place where it is appropriate. You're talking about your, permission to speak freely. Yeah, when the doors close, you can do that. When the doors open, we're not going to do that. So how do you do that? But even more importantly, what I see a lot is, let's just talk about horizontal accountability. People on the same level accountable to one another. Well, that should exist at every level. And when you have employees at a certain level or volunteers or whatever at a certain level that are being told they need this high level of accountability, and then they're looking at the board and they don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
They do something minor, their job's at risk. The board member does something major, and the PR firm is hired
to cover it up
and deal with it. Right?
Yeah.
So you're set. And I think that's one of the big culture killers is that you're using a lot of words, but you're not modeling it. You're not living it. It's not consistently across everywhere.
Back to my client that was picking up the trash.
Exactly. And so it's that, it's very much that aspect of accountability can't move it can't just be one directional, and it has to exist at every level. And I'm going to go further. It has to exist at every level within the organization. Because what I've seen a lot of recently is leaders, owners, CEOs, whatever, will profess that they have accountability, but their accountability is to some outside group or some outside organization.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then would you let your employees do that? I'm accountable, not to the organization. I'm accountable over here with the guys I'm going to go meet with. And I'm not saying that that's bad in and of itself. I think there's aspects of that are needed, but there has to be some degree of accountability contained within the organization in order to get to a good place of culture.
Over the years, I've had leaders come to me and say, Joel, I want you to hold me accountable. Okay. I get the concept. I've actually had some leaders say, I want you to make me accountable. Human to human, like we have agency as individuals. So how, in your opinion, do I make somebody accountable? That person, not the organization, not the structure. Can I make a person who has their own agency accountable? And if so, how?
Wow, that's a really good question. I want to back up. I'm going to get to your question, but I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm going to talk of this in a little bit of a faith context, because I think accountability is another one of those often used, seldom thought about phrases. The only difference in a faith-based sense between being judgmental and being accountable is who is the source, right? So if there's something wrong in your life and I come to you standing on a faith-based premise and call it out in your life, if you haven't invited me into that space, I'm just being judgmental. Unless I've been given an authority and a reason to do that. I'm just being judgmental. So I do like the fact that I think accountability has to be invited and asked for. Which we could go down a whole road about how does that work within an organization, which typically we're demanding accountability rather than letting people ask accountability. And I think that's a result of culture. If you get people's buy-in and they're bought into the mission, they're bought into what's going on over time, then they will embrace the accountability. If people are pushing back on the accountability, it's not necessarily because they're a weak employee or they're trying to go around the edges or not. It's probably because they're not bought in, and you probably need to dig a little bit deeper into why are they not bought in. So how do you make someone accountable? I would go back to those people. They have to lay out the parameters for that, not you. When you say, make me accountable, what are you asking me to do? Right? There are a number of ways I can do that. If that person is, let's pick an issue. we'll pick a moral issue rather than a business issue, but let's say it's alcohol. A person struggles with alcohol and they say, hey, I need you to make me accountable. What are you asking me to make you? Are you asking me, I can ask you every week, is that accountability? Or I can tell you, I need to see your bank statements. Mm-hmm. And I've had both of those in my life. Mm-hmm. I've had men in my life before that I turned over my bank statements every month to on issues where they were holding me accountable. So the make me accountable, like those parameters have to be really clear from the beginning, but the person who's asking to be held accountable has to drive that. Mm-hmm. Now take that to the business side. How often do we, when we're going to put accountability measures in place for a role or a position or whatever, all of that's created at the top, and it's never asked to the people down here, what do you need? What do you need to do your job? What do you need to be held accountable to doing your job? Mm-hmm. Now, someone else up above creates that, and then they impose it downward, rather than inviting those people in the conversation and go, here's what I need. How often have you heard from people in organizations, they keep telling me stuff I need that I don't need, and I keep telling them what I need, and they don't listen? Mm-hmm. Happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. On the idea of making someone accountable, I had a client years ago that actually moved to another part of the United States and has become a really good friend. So when I share this story, it's got a happy ending. But one day, 1 month, I'm reaching out and I finally connect with this person, and he says, well, Joel, I'm paying you to hold me accountable. And I said, well, candidly, between phone calls, emails, and text, I've reached out 7 times this month to have the conversation with you, to be able to try to hold you accountable. So that's what I wrestle with and have for years, this idea of somebody says, well, hold me accountable or make me accountable, or we need to be more accountable. Okay, how much agency is involved in this? Are you asking me?
I'm going to really get in trouble. You're going to get me really in trouble here. That's not accountability. I just don't believe when you put the onus on the other people to self-report, if there's brokenness, they're just going to lie. Why do we expect they're not going to? Please, no phone calls on this one. This is years ago. Years ago, I served on staff at one of the largest churches in America. We had to weekly turn in a report for how many people we had shared the gospel with and what the outcome of that conversation had been. And if your numbers drop below a certain number, then you were called on the floor. I don't think any guy ever turned in an honest report. Pastors on staff at a church. Because you just didn't want to deal with it. And if you knew you had to stay above 10 and you had done 3, you just made up 9 more names so that you weren't at 10, you were at 12. It would just... We say hold me accountable, but then we don't actually put the things in place to take the person out of it so that there's true accountability. Mm-hmm. Right? Hey, hold me to my self-reporting. I don't think you're going to get the results you're looking for. Which, by the way, think of how much data that we rely on in organizations that is so incredibly skewed because of that.
Yeah. I started saying this 30 plus years ago. People perform to how they're measured.
Absolutely.
Right. So they're either going to behave in the way they're measured, or in this case, they performed what they were asked to perform, which was to turn in a self-report of how many conversations they'd had. So either I had those conversations or I fudged the report. Right. But either way, my performance is in response to how I'm being measured.
Well, and there's been such a, this is going to sound weird, there's been such a technological shift in the last 20 years that on one hand, you would think there's a lot more tools, but I actually think there's so many tools now that it's really hard to do. It actually got hard. Like it used to be, if you were doing sales and you worked at a company and they told you needed to make a certain number of calls, they could look at the outgoing call logs. Well, now in order to do that, I'd have to give you access to my personal cell phone. I'd have to give you, right? So we've sort of, the breadth of things is so large that it's much more difficult to do that. But again, I think that comes back to culture, because it comes back to you have to have a close enough connection that appropriate and good conversations are happening, and people are okay saying, hey, here's what I've truly done. I'm asking you to help me to do better beyond a static, flow down of reporting that goes into things.
I'm smiling because there are so many directions we could go with this conversation and be here another several hours. But we probably ought to start to land the plane. Any thoughts you wanted to share we haven't gotten to?
Yeah, I'll run through a couple things. So here's sort of the four things I think are culture builders over time. Number one is having great clarity. Decide what are the elements you want your culture to be. Now, when I say decide what your elements you want your culture to be, I don't mean come up with an acronym or, 4 statements we're going to repeat before every meeting or a bunch of mottos. I mean, define the characteristics, have great clarity. And part of that great clarity happens in word and making it memorable is great, but also in actually doing it. I'll add here, by the way, again, rock the boat. I hate companies who do 1-year themes. I think it's a terrible thing. If you're doing a 1-year theme that's outside of what you've declared you want your culture to be, my question is why? And what is your employee or your people supposed to do? You want me to hold these 4 pillars of culture, but now you're telling me this year we're going to focus on this thing over here.
On a 5th thing.
Right. And so it becomes...
So if the 1 year is a focus on existing...
Focus on one of those existing things,
you're for
support it 100%. But people can't focus on too many things at one time. And we do these we confuse people because we go with the latest trend. That's why I see a lot of companies that never get to culture or to a consistent culture because they're jumping from one thing to the next. It's what's the newest toy, what's the newest, whatever came out. So I think that's one of the big things is you get clarity, cut out the other noise so that you have clarity on what that's going to be. If you want to do a focus, great, but let it be known this is a focus on something that's a part of what we're...
Who we are.
Of already who we are. And by the way, don't import new language. Like use the language that you're going to use consistently. So clarity is the first thing. The second one is cultivation. We talked about it before. It's sort of the modeling kind of thing. Culture is it's observed and practiced. It's not learned and replicated. Culture is caught. It's not taught. So you can do all the teaching things and they need to be there. And by the way, pick up any textbook on cultural anthropology and it'll tell you this. I did in my graduate studies, I did like 4 courses on cultural anthropology and cultural change. And this is one of the big things that stood out in all these studies across the world when they were doing fresh water, when it was this big deal on drilling fresh water. The number of places they would go in and drill these fresh water wells and they would come back 6 months later and the well wasn't being used or was being used for purposes other than drinking water. And they couldn't grasp it. We gave you the solution. We gave you everything. Well, it's because you tried to teach us. You didn't do the work to progressively bring it in. So culture, even in an anthropological sense, is caught. It's not taught, which means that it takes time and it takes that cultivation. The third thing it takes is consistency. So you have to be in for the long haul. If a year later your operational ADD kicks in and you're ready to change things, like we said, 3 to 5 years is the minimum side. That bell curve is definitely skewed toward the longer time. So you just have to be consistent. And when you think of culture as character for an individual, I think we get that a lot more. because we know individually the people we trust the most, the people we look to the most, they have had character that's consistent over a long period of time, and that helps us manage our expectations. And then the fourth one is once you've had culture that's really clear, that's been cultivated, that's been consistent, then it becomes conditioning. And when culture becomes conditioning, when the practice and belief becomes second nature to all the people within the organization, when it becomes a part of your identity when you're in a certain setting, now you've truly established culture. Mm-hmm. Because now you're conditioned. You don't even think about it. You just act, react, respond, right? It's just second nature. Mm. And that's when you truly have culture. And if we think of culture in any other setting other than corporate or business, we think of it in a world setting, we go, well, yeah, people in other countries and in other world cultures, they're not there with a list of mottos. Right? They're just, it is what they are. It's become not even second nature, but even first nature. Mm-hmm. And so why are we not trying to do that same thing corporately? To get to a part where people are just conditioned, that takes that long period of time for them to grow into.
Good thoughts. Brother, thanks for being back on the show.
Oh, my privilege.
Love the wisdom you shared today.
Hope somebody learned something from it, and feel free to interact on it on the other side, on the responses and things. Would love to dive into it.
Well, we'll have you back sometime soon.
All right. Look forward to it.
Brother.
Blessings.
Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.